My name is Claire Miller. 38 years old. I was 17 when I got pregnant. My father Arthur called his attorney that night. 3 days later, I was standing in November rain with one suitcase. That wasn't enough for him. He had a notary draw up papers I would permanently forfeit all rights to the Vance name. And there was one more line: any child I might carry would be erased from that family before it ever drew breath. Those papers are still in the fireproof box in my closet. 20 years passed. Last month, my father and my mother Eleanor drove up from Atlanta. They'd seen a magazine profile my daughter Maya, Northwestern medical student and assumed grandson. They needed a male heir to secure Arthur's board chair. My father placed a $500,000 check on my counter. Just bring the boy to the gala. I didn't touch the check. I took my daughter to dinner instead. I wanted them to see her themselves. Maya sat down at the table. My daughter, first-year medical student. My father looked past her toward the entrance. When is the boy coming? We have donors to impress. Maya's face went still. It was my face. 20 years ago. My mother set down her wine. Medicine is a hobby for girls. The board needs a face. A name. She has a name, I said. You just never learned it. My father looked at me the way he looks at numbers that don't cooperate. They hadn't come back for me. They'd come to buy a prop. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. What they found instead was their auditor. The 401k statements had a particular smell. Not the paper itself that was standard issue, the same recycled stock that came off every commercial printer in the city. But the accumulated weight of them, dozens of manila folders stacked in 2 columns on Claire Miller's desk. Each one representing a person who trusted her firm to protect what they'd spent decades building. Pension contributions, retirement timelines, the quiet arithmetic of a life's labor, reduced to columns and percentages and projected growth curves. Claire liked that smell. It meant something real. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of her 43rd floor office in the Chicago Loop, November was doing what November always did: stripping the trees bare. Turning the lake into a sheet of hammered pewter, reminding the city that beauty had a season and this wasn't it. The morning sun had given up around 10 a.m., retreating behind a wall of low gray clouds that pressed down over the skyline like a hand on a shoulder. Not comforting, insistent. She reached for her coffee without looking up, found the mug by muscle memory, and took a sip that had gone lukewarm 40 minutes ago. On her computer screen, a spreadsheet waited. Column D showed discrepancies between employer contributions and the posted account balances for 3 employees in the manufacturing sector: small numbers. The kind that got swallowed in quarterly reports, the kind that someone hoped no one would notice. Claire noticed everything. She had been noticing things since she was 7 years old, standing in her father's study in Atlanta. Watching him sort correspondence into 2 piles: the letters he would answer, and the letters he would pretend had never arrived. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now with the particular clarity that came from having been, at 17, sorted into the second pile herself. The radiator in the corner of her office clicked and hissed. She glanced at it, an old habit, the instinct to locate a sound before dismissing it. And then her eyes moved to the security feed on the secondary monitor at the left edge of her desk. The black sedan was still there. Georgia plates. She'd noticed it an hour ago, idling at the curb on the west side of the building. Pulled just far enough into the shadow of the parking structure to look deliberate. Most people wouldn't have given it a second thought. Chicago had cars. Cars idled. But Claire had been managing other people's assets for 15 years. And she had learned early that the things people tried to make invisible were always the things worth watching. She minimized the spreadsheet and pulled the security feed to full screen. The sedan hadn't moved. The engine was running. She could see the faint exhaust rising in the cold air. The windows were tinted, and at this angle, at this distance, she couldn't make out the occupant. But she could read the plates. She'd pulled them up 40 minutes ago on the building's visitor database and come up empty. Not a client, not a delivery, not a routine parking situation. Georgia plates. The words settled into her chest like swallowed ice, and she sat very still for a moment, her fingers resting on the keyboard without pressing anything. She was 38 years old. She had built a firm from a leased office and a laptop and 2 clients who'd believed in her before she believed entirely in herself. She had raised a daughter alone, mostly, and fiercely, and well. She had structured her life with the same precision she applied to the portfolios on her desk. Every decision deliberate, every exposure calculated, every risk assessed before it was taken. She had not thought about Atlanta and she'd lost count. She had been 17, pregnant, and inconvenient, 3 things the Vance name could not afford. Long enough that it had begun to feel like something that had happened to someone else. A different girl in a different life. The registered mail arrived at 11:14 a.m. She knew it was registered because the building's front desk called up to tell her before the courier even reached the elevator. A certified letter, Ms. Miller. Return receipt requested. Standard language for legal correspondence, medical bills. Things that required confirmation of delivery because someone, somewhere, needed to be able to prove they had tried. When the envelope arrived on her desk, she understood immediately why the sedan had been parked outside for 3 hours. The crest was embossed on the upper left corner of the heavy ivory stock, deep navy and gold. A style of stationery that cost more per sheet than most people paid for lunch. She hadn't seen that crest in 20 years. The sight of it moved through her nervous system not as a thought but as a physical sensation, something cold unspooling from her sternum to her fingertips. She didn't open it, not immediately. She sat with it on the desk in front of her. The way you might sit with a letter from a doctor's office knowing, before you read a word, that the reading of it will change something. The knowing and the reading being 2 different moments, and the space between them belonging entirely to you. I thought I'd buried them deep enough. The radiator hissed again. Outside, a gust off the lake threw a scatter of dead leaves against the glass. The sedan below had not moved. She opened the letter. The Vance Family Foundation cordially invites you to the annual Legacy Gala, a celebration of heritage, excellence, and the next generation of leadership. Black tie. A hotel in Atlanta she recognized by name. A date 6 weeks out. I haven't seen that crest in 20 years, she whispered, and she hadn't meant to say it aloud. The words arrived. Already formed, already leaving her, the way certain true things do when your guard drops for a half second. Her fingers were trembling against the heavy envelope. She pressed them flat to the desk, felt the cool surface, breathed. Heritage, excellence, the next generation of leadership. She almost laughed. She would have laughed, if the sound weren't sitting somewhere in her throat like something lodged. The office door opened without a knock. Maya's entrance style had been since she was small. The confidence of someone who had never been made to feel she needed permission, and Claire's hand moved before her mind caught up with it. Sliding the letter under the stack of mortgage notices on the left corner of her desk. A smooth, practiced motion. The motion of someone who had learned, at a young age, how to make things disappear. Mom, are you eating today, or are we doing the thing where you have coffee at noon and call it working through lunch? Maya stood in the doorway in her coat, her Northwestern ID badge still clipped to her lapel from an early seminar. 19 years old and already carrying herself like someone twice that age, not with stiffness, but with the quiet certainty of a person who knew what they were for. Claire watched her, and felt the familiar particular ache of it. The pride and the terror that existed together, the way they always did when you loved something this much. I was just about to order, Claire said. Maya's eyes moved across the desk with the clinical instincts she'd been developing since she started shadowing physicians at 16. You have 4 folders open, your coffee's cold, and that spreadsheet has been on the same column since I walked by 2 hours ago. She raised an eyebrow. So, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong. I was distracted by something outside. Maya crossed to the window and looked down at the street. The sedan was still there. She stared at it for a moment, not alarmed, just noticing. That car's been there for a while. I know. Georgia plates. I know. Maya looked at her mother. Claire held her gaze steadily, the way she had learned to hold it, the way that communicated. I have this handled without actually saying anything that could be questioned or pushed on. It was a particular skill. She had spent 20 years perfecting it. Okay, Maya said finally, accepting for now the non-answer. In the way that young people accept the things their parents won't explain, filing it somewhere to return to later. I'll pick up food. Don't move, Maya. Claire waited until her daughter turned back. Don't open the door for anyone today. Anyone who isn't me, isn't building staff. Understood? Something shifted in Maya's expression, a flicker of the child she'd been, recalibrating against the adult she was becoming. She nodded and left, and the office was quiet again. Claire turned back to her window. In the glass, 43 floors above the city she had chosen and claimed and made her own, her reflection looked back at her. Tailored blazer, her name on the door behind her. 15 years of built-in silence, of strategic distance, of careful construction. And behind the woman in the designer suit, if she allowed herself to look, the scared 17-year-old was still there. Standing in the rain, watching the study window, waiting to see what he would do next. Some ghosts don't stay dead, she thought. They wait for the right interest rate. She turned away from her reflection, reached for her phone, and began to plan. The penthouse doorbell rang at 7:43 on a Tuesday evening, and Claire knew before she reached the intercom. She had known since that morning. Since the sedan. Since the letter she'd slid under the mortgage notices and then, later, locked in the fireproof box in her bedroom closet. Where she kept the things that needed to be sealed away from the daily architecture of her life. She had known the way you know a storm is coming, not from the forecast but from the particular quality of the air, something charged and heavy. Something that makes the small hairs on the back of your neck rise before a single cloud appears. She pressed the intercom button. The lobby camera showed two figures. A man and a woman, both in their 60s. Both dressed in the particular way of people who had never in their adult lives purchased anything that wasn't expensive. The man wore a charcoal overcoat with a collar that cost more than most people's car payments. The woman's coat was camel-colored, belted, the kind of thing that appeared in the pages of magazines that used the word classic to mean beyond your reach. Arthur Vance. Eleanor Vance. Her parents. She hadn't said those words in so long that they arrived in her mind stripped of meaning, like a term repeated until it becomes only sound. She buzzed them up. She had 11 seconds while the elevator climbed. She used them to straighten the throw pillow on the sofa, move Maya's anatomy textbook to the coffee table, rather than the kitchen island, and breathe 3 deliberate counts in, 3 out, the way her therapist had taught her at 22, when she had finally been able to afford one. When she opened the door, Arthur Vance looked exactly like 20 years of comfortable living on other people's money. The lines on his face were the lines of a man who frowned at subordinates, not of a man who had worried about anything. Eleanor was softer in appearance, she had always been, but Claire had learned young that the softness was a surface condition. Like the pleasing crust on something that would burn your mouth if you bit through it. They entered without being invited to. That, too, was familiar. Claire. Arthur's voice had the same timbre she remembered, deep, measured, the voice of a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where everyone listened. You look well. She did not offer to take their coats. She did not offer coffee. She stood near the kitchen island with her arms at her sides and waited. We should sit, Eleanor said, moving toward the living room as if she had been in this apartment before, as if it were a space she had any claim to. I'd rather stand, Claire said. What do you want? The directness landed. She watched it land, a small tightening around Arthur's jaw, Eleanor's eyes going a degree cooler. They were people who expected to control the pace of things. She had not given them the pace. Arthur reached into the interior pocket of his overcoat and placed a cashier's check on the kitchen island. Claire looked at it without touching it. The amount was printed in the clean, unambiguous font of official banking documents. $500,000. We saw the feature, Eleanor said. In Midwest Financial Review. Your firm. The profile piece. I know the piece. A remarkable achievement, Arthur said, and the words had the quality of something rehearsed, not insincere. Exactly, but applied, the way a label is applied to a bottle. Building something like this. We had no idea you'd, he paused. Landed on your feet. Landed on your feet. The phrase arrived and Claire absorbed it without expression. Landed on your feet, as if she had fallen, accidentally, and happened by luck to survive. As if the falling hadn't been their work. As if the surviving hadn't been entirely hers. The foundation's board chair position is up for succession, Arthur continued. He placed his hand flat on the kitchen island, the gesture of a man presenting facts rather than making requests. I intend to secure it. The board has certain expectations about family legacy, continuity, an heir who demonstrates the kind of caliber that the Vance name represents. He slid the check an inch forward, as if the gesture clarified something. We told the board of the foundation, he said, that our grandson is a brilliant medical student at Northwestern. The air in the room changed. Claire felt it, the specific quality of a silence that follows a statement that reveals, all at once, exactly how thoroughly you have not been seen. She stood with that silence for a moment, the way you stand in the aftermath of something you've been bracing for, cataloging the damage. With a steadiness that comes from already having prepared. They had seen the article. The photograph of Claire at her desk. The caption listing her firm's assets under management. The brief mention, warm, proud, one sentence of her daughter, a first-year medical student. They had not read it carefully enough to know her daughter's name. They had seen medical student and Northwestern and had assembled from those facts. The air they needed, the way a person assembles furniture from a photograph without reading the instructions. They had assumed a son. They had built their entire return on that assumption. You don't even know her name, do you? Claire said. The question arrived quietly, without heat. That was important. The heat was there, she could feel it somewhere below her sternum. The old familiar burn of it, 20 years of compound interest, but she kept it below the surface, where it would be useful rather than visible. Arthur blinked. Eleanor's gaze moved to the window. The article said, my daughter. It said my child. Claire looked at the check on her island. She did not touch it. You assumed the rest. You needed a male heir to secure your board position, and you found a magazine profile and built a fiction around it. And then you flew to Chicago to purchase the cooperation of a woman you erased from your family when she was 17 years old. The word erased sat in the room between them. Eleanor made a sound, not quite a protest, not quite an acknowledgement. The sound of a person who has spent decades managing the emotional fallout of other people's decisions, the sound of sustained, sophisticated deflection. Arthur straightened. The foundation represents 4 decades of philanthropic work. The succession. I understand what the foundation represents, Claire said. I'm a CPA. I also understand cashier's checks, and I understand what it means when one appears on my kitchen island without a prior conversation. You don't come to see me. You come to acquire something. That's what this is. The check sat between them, inert, heavy, radiating the particular silence of money that has been offered in the wrong context. They are selling me back the life they stole. She looked at it. $500,000. She had billed more than that last fiscal year in management fees alone. She knew, in the cold mathematical part of her mind that never entirely went quiet, exactly what the check represented: not generosity, not repair, not even guilt. A transaction. The purchase of a prop for their performance. The board gala is in 6 weeks, Arthur said. He had recovered his composure. He was good at that. We need a face, a name, someone who can stand beside us and confirm the legacy narrative. You need a grandson, Claire said. You need a grandson, she repeated, and this time there was something in her voice that made him stop. Because that's what you told them. And now you're here to see if you can produce one. And the check is in case I need persuading. She looked from the money to her father's face, the face she hadn't seen in 2 decades. The face that in certain lights still appeared in her memory without warning, the way significant things do. What you have is a granddaughter. 19 years old, first-year medical student, Northwestern, full scholarship. She paused. The most remarkable person I have ever known. Eleanor cleared her throat. The board expects what you told them. Claire reached across and turned the check face down on the island, the way you turn over something you've finished reading. You told them a story. You came here to make the story true. And the story is wrong. Arthur looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was when she remembered the particular look of a man who is recalculating, not reconsidering. There was a difference. Reconsideration implied the possibility of being wrong. Arthur Vance had spent 68 years not being wrong. We'd like to meet her, he said finally. A dinner. Something formal. Something that could be assessed. Claire thought about Maya, who was 2 blocks away at a study group, who had come home that morning. With textbook annotations in 3 colors and a coffee stain on her sleeve and absolute unshakable certainty about who she was and what she was going to build. Their love is a currency I no longer trade in. I'll think about it, Claire said, which was not yes, and was not the no she hadn't yet earned the full right to give. She showed them to the door. Arthur retrieved the check from the island. On his way out she noted that, filed it away. Eleanor murmured something about the apartment being lovely. The elevator doors closed. Claire stood in her kitchen for a long time, listening to the building settle around her. Feeling the particular quality of the quiet after something has been set in motion that cannot be recalled. The restaurant was called Meridian. It occupied the top floor of a River North hotel, the kind of place where the menus had no prices. And the lighting was calibrated to make everyone look like a better version of themselves, and the silence between tables was maintained by architectural design. And the mutual understanding of everyone present that certain conversations were not meant to carry. White tablecloths, a view of the river, a wine list that arrived in a leather folder thicker than most novels. Arthur had chosen it, which told Claire everything she needed to know about how he intended the evening to proceed. He wanted witnesses, not to the conversation itself. Meridian's ambient acoustics ensured privacy, but to the visual. The tableau. Arthur Vance, distinguished and silver-haired, hosting a family dinner at the right kind of establishment, doing the right kind of visible thing. Image was his native language. He had been speaking it for 68 years. Claire arrived first, deliberately, and spent the 4 minutes before her parents appeared cataloging the room, the sightlines, the exits, the position of their reserved table relative to the entrance. She ordered water and did not open the menu. She had not told Maya much. Dinner. Some people I knew a long time ago. Wear something you'd wear to a faculty reception. Maya, who had never been given reason to distrust her mother's read on a situation, had nodded and put on a dark blazer over her good blouse. And clipped her Northwestern ID to her lapel before Claire gently suggested she leave it in the car. Maya had laughed. Right. Not a networking event. Something like that. They sat together now at the table, and Claire watched her daughter look at the menu with the same focused equanimity. She brought to everything assessment first, then decision. No performance. No self-consciousness. Just Maya being Maya, entirely and without apology, in a room designed to make certain people feel insufficient. The Vances arrived at 7 on the dot. Arthur moved through the restaurant the way men of his generation and income bracket moved through rooms they considered rightfully theirs, unhurried. Acknowledging the maitre d', with a fractional nod, scanning the space with the peripheral authority of someone accustomed to being the most significant person present. Eleanor walked slightly behind him, a half step, the geography of 43 years of practiced arrangement. They reached the table. Arthur's eyes moved to Maya. Something passed across his face, not disappointment. Exactly, but the rapid recalibration of someone whose expectations have encountered an incompatible reality. His gaze settled on Maya the way it might settle on an unexpected item in a room, noted, categorized, placed in an uncertain column. Then his attention moved past her, to the restaurant entrance, and stayed there. "It's good to see you," Eleanor said to Claire, managing warmth with the precision of someone who had spent decades deploying it strategically. She looked at Maya. "And you must be Maya," Maya said. She had her mother's quality of directness, unhurried, undefensive. "Maya Miller." Eleanor's smile held. "Of course. How lovely." They sat. Water was poured. The wine list was produced and Arthur ordered without consulting anyone else, the way men of a certain type always ordered, not rudeness. Exactly, but the deep-seated assumption of representational authority, the belief that his preference was everyone's preference until demonstrated otherwise. The first 10 minutes were managed conversation. Arthur asked about Claire's firm in the manner of someone gathering data rather than expressing interest. Percentages, assets under management, client demographics. Claire answered in the abbreviated, precise way she answered questions she didn't want to be having. Maya ate her bread and watched the table with the calm, clear-eyed attention of someone taking notes in a lecture. Then Arthur turned back toward the entrance. "When is the boy coming?" he said. "We have donors to impress." The sentence arrived and sat in the center of the table like something placed there deliberately. Maya went very still. Claire watched her daughter's face, the way the warmth in it didn't vanish, but underwent a subtle, specific change, the way a clear sky can look identical to itself one moment before the temperature drops. Maya set her bread plate down with a care that was its own kind of statement. "I'm sorry?" Maya said. "The article mentioned a medical student," Arthur said, addressing Claire, his eyes still moving occasionally toward the entrance. "Northwestern. I assumed the way it was written." "The way it was written," Claire said, "was accurate." Eleanor set down her wineglass. "Arthur means that the Foundation's board has certain presentation expectations. At the gala, a young man in medicine reads quite differently than," she gestured, a small, calibrated motion that was meant to land somewhere between diplomatic and explanatory, and landed somewhere else entirely. "Than a young woman?" Maya said. Her voice was even, not cold, even, which was, in certain contexts, more devastating than cold. "Than a girl in what amounts to a preliminary stage," Eleanor said. And Claire watched her mother's mouth form the words with the smoothness of someone who had rehearsed very different language and was improvising at the last moment. "Medicine is a fine choice for someone with your background. But the Vance Foundation requires a face that projects leadership," Arthur said. He had finally stopped looking at the entrance and had directed his full attention to the table. And Claire recognized the quality of that attention, the focused, assessing look he deployed when a situation required management. He looked at Maya the way he looked at things he was deciding whether to use. "The board is traditional. There's no getting around that. A male face at the succession, a physician, ideally, or a barrister, reads as continuity. As legacy." The table was silent. Claire watched Maya, watched her sit with the silence and the words that had just been said to her in a restaurant that cost more per plate than most people made in a day, by grandparents who had driven to Chicago in a black sedan to purchase a prop and discovered, instead, a person, and were now, in real time, deciding the person wasn't what they'd ordered. It was her own face. 20 years younger, but her own face, the precise expression she had worn at 17. Standing in her father's study, watching him look through her at the version of her he had needed her to be. She gripped the silver spoon in her hand until it bit into her palm. Under the table, Arthur had shifted. She noticed it. His napkin had slid from his lap to the floor, and when he reached down to retrieve it, she saw for just a moment a slim leather ledger, half tucked beneath his folded napkin on the table, the kind carried by men who liked to keep records near them. She had seen him move it when she glanced at it. A small, practiced motion. "She is the only heir you'll ever have, Arthur," Claire said. The sentence came out flat and clean and final, like a door closing on a latch. Arthur looked at her, his jaw tightened by a fraction that most people would have missed. Claire had spent 38 years learning to read exactly that fraction. Eleanor placed her hand over Arthur's on the table. A steadying gesture, or possibly a restraining one. "We're simply discussing possibilities," Eleanor said, her voice recalibrated back to warmth, the dial turned precisely far enough to suggest reasonableness. "There's no need to." "To what?" Maya said. She had put her spoon down. She was looking at Eleanor with the direct, fearless attention of someone who has not yet learned to pretend she didn't hear what she just heard, and who, Claire thought, with a ferocity of love that was almost physical, should never have to learn that. "To be honest? To say what you actually meant? Because you said it. Medicine is a hobby for girls. I'm not the face the board wants." She looked from Eleanor to Arthur. "You came to Chicago looking for a grandson. And you didn't find one. And now you're sitting here deciding what I'm worth to your narrative." She picked up her water glass. "I'm a first-year medical student with a 3.94 GPA. I'm going into cardiology, and I'm worth more than your board's comfort with my gender." The table around them continued its careful ambient performance, silverware, low conversation, the discreet choreography of service. Arthur and Eleanor Vance looked at their granddaughter across the white tablecloth. And their expressions had the quality of people who have encountered something they cannot immediately classify. Claire looked at her daughter and felt, beneath the dread of what was coming, something that had no name but was close to gratitude. "They are erasing her right in front of me." She reached under the table and found Maya's hand, pressed it once, briefly, and let go. The ledger had disappeared from the table. Arthur's napkin was back in his lap, the practiced smoothness of someone who had been managing inconvenient information for 40 years. He hid something, she noted, in the part of her mind where things got stored for later. He always hides something. She filed it, and she smiled at Eleanor across the table, the specific, controlled smile of a woman who had been a CPA for 15 years. And knew, better than almost anyone, that the most important numbers were always the ones that didn't appear on the visible ledger. She waited until Maya was asleep. That was the calculation, not deliberate, not even fully conscious, but operating in the background the way her most important decisions always operated, below the threshold of announcement. She needed Maya to be asleep before she could be alone with what the evening had left in her. The apartment was quiet in the particular way of a city apartment after midnight, not silence, but the layered near silence of a building full of people. The distant percussion of traffic 14 stories down, the hiss of forced air through the radiators. The occasional creak of the structure settling against November wind. Claire had lived here for 7 years and knew every sound of it, had catalogued them all in the first weeks the way she catalogued everything. Building a map of what belonged so she would recognize anything that didn't. She sat on the living room floor. Not the couch. The floor, with her back against the sofa, her knees drawn up, in the specific posture. She reverted to when something was too large for her to process sitting upright like an adult. It was a child's posture. She had never been able to stop doing it when the weight became a certain kind of weight. Around her on the rug, organized with a precision that was automatic. The way her hands organized things when her mind was occupied elsewhere, the 529 plan documents. 7 years' worth. Quarterly statements, contribution records, projected distributions. The paper trail of every decision she had made since Maya was 12, when Claire had sat down with a calculator and a long-term care estimate. And the cold determination of someone who would never allow her child to be unprotected. Education funding, health coverage, emergency reserves, the arithmetic of shielding someone from every contingency she could name and several she couldn't. She had built it all herself. Every line item, every projection. She looked at the documents spread around her on the floor of her living room and felt, in a way that was harder to process than anger, the particular grief of a person who has been working very hard for a very long time against the possibility of being abandoned again. And who has just discovered that the thing she was guarding against had never actually gone away. It had only been waiting. Then she stood, went to the bedroom closet, moved the folded sweaters on the upper shelf, and retrieved the fireproof box. She hadn't opened it in 3 years. She kept it because getting rid of it had never felt safe the way certain documents need to remain in existence. Even when you never want to look at them, because the act of destroying them would mean trusting in the permanence of something you have not yet earned the right to trust. The box was gray metal, 10 inches by 8, with a combination lock she'd set to Maya's birthday. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat under the overhead light. She knew what was inside. She had known since she filed it in there 11 years ago, in her first Chicago apartment. 3 rooms and a window that looked onto a parking structure when she had finally stopped moving long enough to properly organize her life's paperwork. She had put the Vance documents at the bottom, under everything else, and locked the box, and placed it in a closet, and told herself she was done with it. She opened the box. The disinheritance letter was on top. It was always on top, no matter how she tried to arrange the documents otherwise. Or perhaps she only remembered it that way, the way certain things arrange themselves at the front of memory regardless of where you put them. Notarized, July 2006. Executed in the offices of Hartwell and Braun, Attorneys at Law, Atlanta. Arthur Vance, signatory. Eleanor Vance, witness. Be it known that Claire Ann Vance, minor child of the undersigned, hereby forfeits all rights, entitlements, and associations with the Vance family name, lineage, and estate, including any and all claims made on behalf of any dependents thereof. She read it the way she had read it before, slowly, because the language required it. But also because reading it slowly was the only way to hold it at a pace where it didn't become something else. Something unmanageable. Any dependents thereof. She had been 17 and pregnant, a liability the Vance name could not afford. Arthur Vance had had good attorneys, the kind who knew how to write documents that covered contingencies the family wished had never existed. The kind who understood that a liability, properly managed, could be foreclosed on before it cost you anything. Maya had been a legal ghost before she took her first breath. She set the letter down on the kitchen table and pressed both palms flat against the surface. The table was cold. She concentrated on the temperature of it, the texture, the solidity of something she could feel with her hands. They only came back because their image was at risk. The thought arrived not as revelation but as confirmation of something she had already known and had not wanted to know. The sedan in the parking structure. The cashier's check on the island. The dinner at Meridian, the careful staging of it, the wine Arthur ordered without asking, the ledger he moved when he thought she was looking away. None of it had been about her. It had never been about her. They had read an article about a medical student and seen a piece they were missing, and they had come to acquire it. And they had discovered it came attached to complications they hadn't accounted for. A daughter instead of a son. A granddaughter who looked at you and said that's what you meant without flinching. She pressed her hands harder against the table. I am still just a line item they want to delete. The thought came with a specific texture of shame that she recognized from a long time ago, not shame. Exactly, but the thing underneath shame, the more primitive thing. The wordless internal conviction, installed at an age before she had the language to dispute it, that there was something essentially deletable about her. Something that justified being sorted into the second pile. Something that made a 17-year-old girl the kind of problem you solved with legal documents and a notary. She knew, in the part of herself built from 15 years of professional clarity and expensive therapy, and the hard daily practice of building something real, that the conviction was wrong. She knew it the way you know things you have had to prove to yourself through accumulation, not instinct, but record. Evidence. Column after column of evidence that she was not what they'd said she was. But knowing something and being immune to it were different things. She clutched the letter against her chest. The paper was rough against her palms, the edges slightly worn from 2 decades of being handled, filed, locked away, handled again. She pressed it there and sat in the kitchen under the overhead light with the 529 documents spread in the next room and the city's quiet industry continuing 14 floors below, and felt, silently, the grief of it, the specific, compound grief of a woman who had rebuilt herself completely and still, when the original architects of her demolition appeared, felt the rubble shift beneath her feet. Am I just a ghost to everyone? She said it to the kitchen. No one heard it. She said it anyway. She sat with it for a long time, the way you sit with things that have no answer. That don't need an answer, that just need to be sat with for a while in the dark before you can carry them back into the light. Then she put the letter back in the box. Pressed the lid closed. Heard the latch catch. She was 38 years old. She had a firm with her name on the door. She had a daughter asleep 20 feet away who had looked at Arthur Vance across a white tablecloth and told him exactly what she was worth. She had the documents. She had the numbers. And she was a CPA, which meant she understood, better than most people, that a ledger left open was a ledger that could still be corrected. She replaced the box in the closet. She went to the kitchen and made herself a full cup of coffee. Hot, this time, and sat at the table with it until morning began to gray the windows, and began, quietly, to think. Friends, what a journey we've been on with Claire Miller. She built everything from nothing, a firm, a life, a daughter she raised alone with nothing but determination and love. And then the past came back. Not with an apology, not with regret, with a cashier's check and a request for a prop. What broke my heart most wasn't Arthur's arrogance, or Eleanor's careful deflections. It was that kitchen table at midnight, Claire, clutching a 20-year-old document that said she was legally erased, wondering if she'd ever stopped being a ghost. But here's what the Vances don't understand yet. Claire Miller has spent 15 years doing one thing better than almost anyone alive. She follows the money, and something tells me the Vance Foundation's ledger is about to get a very thorough audit. Stay with us because the second half of this story belongs entirely to Claire. She had been 9 years old the first time she understood what her father did with numbers. Not the mechanics of it, the mechanics she grasped easily, had always grasped easily, the way certain children take to language or music or spatial reasoning. As though it were simply the medium they were built to think in. She understood accounting the way she understood breathing naturally, without instruction, as a function she performed without having to learn how. What she understood at 9 was the use of it. She had been sitting in the corner of her father's study on a Saturday afternoon, doing homework at the small desk he'd placed there for her, a concession, she understood now, to the fact that she preferred to work near him, that she had spent her earliest years believing proximity to Arthur Vance was a form of safety. He was on the phone. She was supposed to be invisible. The way children in that house were always supposed to be present, but not requiring attention, decorative rather than substantive. She had not been invisible. She had been listening. The allocation looks wrong on the public filings, but the private trust catches it. Nobody below partner level reads both documents. That's the gap. She hadn't understood all of it, but she understood gap. She understood that a gap was a space between two true things where something could be hidden. She had spent 30 years not thinking about that conversation. She thought about it now, standing in the rain at 17 in the Atlanta memory that lived permanently in the part of her mind where things that had formed her were stored, not as trauma exactly, but as instruction. She had told them on a Tuesday evening quietly, at the dinner table, the way you tell people things you already know will cost you everything. By Thursday, her father had called the attorney. By Friday, the suitcase was packed for her. The rain had come without warning. The kind of southern downpour that materialized in November with an almost theatrical completeness, not beginning as drizzle and building, but arriving all at once, full weight, warm and cold at the same time. She had been on the porch with a single suitcase. The one she'd managed to pack in the 40 minutes between her father's announcement and the sound of the deadbolt. Through the study window, she could see him, Arthur Vance, at his mahogany desk, in the lamplight, methodically feeding documents into the shredder. Not quickly, not frantically, with the composed efficiency of a man performing an administrative task. He'd been planning long enough that the emotion of it had already passed, already been processed somewhere private and then set aside. Birth certificate, whatever else he'd determined required erasure. Her mother had not watched. Eleanor had closed the heavy oak doors from the inside. She'd heard the sound of the latch. The specific weight of it, that particular finality, and that had been the last thing. The door, the deadbolt, the rain. Across the street, on the porch of the yellow house, Mr. Henderson had been sitting in his rocking chair with a glass of something, the way he always did on Saturday evenings, weather permitting and sometimes weather not permitting. He was 81. He had lived on that street for 50 years. He did not move, or look away, and she understood from the quality of his stillness that he saw everything. He had been holding something. In the present, 21 years later, standing in her Chicago apartment with the city quiet outside and Maya still asleep, Claire understood for the first time what it was. A remote. The small rectangular control for his porch security camera, old footage by now. 21 years old, but recorded on a system she remembered was connected to a local monitoring service, the kind that archived to physical drives. She pulled out her laptop. Mr. Henderson had died 4 years ago. She'd seen the obituary, had found it the way she periodically found herself searching for Atlanta names she'd left behind, the involuntary archaeology of a life she'd tried to stop excavating. He'd had a daughter in Marietta who'd inherited the property. The daughter's name was Patricia. Patricia Henderson Rourke. She was 54, a retired schoolteacher. She had a Facebook page that was public and active and full of photographs of grandchildren and a garden. Claire stared at her laptop screen. I was never a daughter, she thought. I was a liability they managed out of existence. She opened a new email. She thought about what she'd seen in the restaurant, Arthur's hand moving the ledger beneath the napkin. The practiced smoothness of it. She thought about a Saturday afternoon at 9 years old. And the word gap, and the knowledge that her father had spent 40 years exploiting the space between two true things. She was an auditor. She knew exactly how to close a gap. She pressed her fingers to the keyboard and began to type. The forensic digital recovery firm was called Meridian Data Solutions. The coincidence of the name was not lost on her. And she spent half a second on it before filing it as irrelevant, and their offices were in a converted warehouse in Pilsen, where 3 people with advanced degrees in computer forensics did work that looked, from the outside, like nothing much, and was, in practice, the recovery of things people had believed were permanently gone. Claire had worked with them twice before. Both times on behalf of clients whose business partners had deleted records they'd have preferred remained deleted. Both times, Meridian had found what she needed. Data recovery was, at its core, the same as forensic accounting. The belief that nothing was ever completely erased, that deletion was a surface condition, that underneath every apparent absence was a record of what had been present. She sat across from their lead recovery specialist, a woman named Joanna, mid-30s, with the particular quality of focused calm that came from spending years reconstructing things. Other people had tried to destroy and explained what she needed. Old security footage. Atlanta, Georgia. A residential property on Haverford Street. Approximately 2006. The system had been a local monitoring setup. The kind common in that era, connected to a physical archive service whose name she could approximate from memory. If the archive service still exists, Joanna said, and the daughter inherited the drive or the access credentials along with the property, it's recoverable. Possibly degraded, but recoverable. What's the timeline? Depends on whether she still has the hardware. 2 weeks if she does. 6 to 8 if we need to go through the service's backup chain. Claire nodded. She had already contacted Patricia Henderson Rourke. A careful email introducing herself as a former neighbor, expressing condolences about Mr. Henderson's passing that were genuine enough to survive scrutiny, asking, gently, whether Patricia had retained any of her father's old home security equipment. Patricia had responded within 4 hours with the warmth of someone who was happy to hear from anyone connected to her father's memory. She still had the drive. She'd been meaning to sort through it for years. Was there something specific Claire was looking for? Yes, Claire had written back. There is. While Meridian worked, Claire worked. The Vance Foundation's public filings were a matter of record accessible through the standard nonprofit databases. Freely available to anyone who knew where to look and had the patience to cross-reference the relevant tax documents, which most people did not. Claire had the patience. Claire had, in fact, spent 15 years developing exactly the kind of patience required to read a financial document the way other people read a detective novel, looking not for what was stated, but for what the stated numbers implied about what hadn't been stated. She pulled every Form 990 the Foundation had filed in the past 12 years. She spread them across her second monitor in chronological order, and she read them the way she read everything, starting with the footnotes. Most people started with the headline figures. The total assets, the program revenue, the compensation disclosures. Those were the numbers the Foundation wanted you to see, the ones that told the story of philanthropic excellence and legacy and responsible stewardship. Claire trusted them approximately as much as she trusted any document prepared by people with a strong interest in its conclusions. The footnotes were where the interesting things lived. It took her 4 days. 4 days of cross-referencing restricted fund allocations with the Foundation's reported program expenditures. Mapping the discrepancies against the fiscal years in which Arthur's board position had come up for review. Tracing the movement of a particular restricted endowment labeled, with a specificity that suggested considerable effort. The Vance Future Leadership Fund across entities and instruments, and a series of transfers that were individually defensible and cumulatively, Claire was now quite certain, not. The gap. There it was. The space between the public filing and the private arrangement. 21 years of practice, but the architecture was recognizable. She had heard its first blueprint at 9 years old in a study in Atlanta. I'm not just an accountant, she told her reflection in the dark window of her office at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. The city moved behind her, indifferent and vast. I'm the auditor of their sins. She saved the evidence folder. Organized it the way she organized everything: chronological, labeled, cross-referenced. Formatted for legibility by someone who had not spent 15 years learning to read these documents. A lawyer, or a board, or a journalist. Her brother called at midnight. Daniel was 41, still in Atlanta, still living the particular reduced life of a person who had spent 4 decades inside Arthur Vance's perimeter, not broken, but compressed, the way things get compressed when they're held down long enough. He'd called twice in the past year on the usual calendar markers: Claire's birthday, Maya's birthday. They had not discussed their parents. They did not, generally, discuss their parents. It was a mutual agreement arrived at without ever being stated. I heard they went to Chicago, he said. They did. You could have called me. I know. She paused. I'm calling you now. A long silence on the line. The particular silence of a person doing the calculation of what something is going to cost them. Daniel had his own position in the Foundation's orbit, modest, advisory. The kind that provided just enough connection to protect his interests while requiring just enough deference to keep him manageable. Arthur was good at that. Keeping people at exactly the radius where they were useful. There's footage, Claire said. From Mr. Henderson's security camera. Joanna says it's recoverable. Of what he did, Daniel said. Not a question. Of what they both did. Another silence. She heard him breathing the slow, considering breath of someone who has been holding something for a long time and is now deciding whether to put it down. What do you need from me? He said. The files you mentioned 2 years ago. The ones you said you'd kept. The internal correspondence from 2006. She waited. It's time to release them. She heard him move. A chair. A drawer, maybe. The sounds of a man who had known this call was coming for longer than he'd admitted to himself. Okay, Daniel said. Okay. She clicked upload on the evidence folder. Watched the progress bar move across her screen, slow, methodical, inevitable. The numbers never lie, she thought. Even when parents do. Let's see how the board likes this legacy, she said to the empty office, and meant it. The Vance Legacy Gala occupied the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel in Buckhead. 24,000 square feet of the kind of splendor that communicated, without stating, that the people assembled here were not people who worried about the cost of things. Chandeliers descended from the coffered ceiling like frozen waterfalls. The tables were set with the Foundation's navy and gold, Arthur's crest reproduced on every program, every name card, every folded napkin. At the front of the room, a raised stage framed by 2 screens currently dark, currently waiting had been constructed for the evening's main address. The room was full. Claire stood at the entrance to the ballroom and took it in. 200 people, perhaps more, in black tie and evening gowns, the Foundation's board members. Atlanta's philanthropic establishment, journalists from 3 outlets she recognized, and in the far corner near the bar. A cluster of men in suits who had the posture of attorneys and the watchful expression of people being paid to be watchful. She catalogued them all in the practiced, rapid way she catalogued rooms. Maya stood beside her. She had not told Maya everything. She had told her enough to make clear what tonight was, what it was for. What might happen, and Maya had listened the way she listened to complex clinical information, assembling it into sequence, identifying the decision points. She had not argued. She had not expressed alarm. She had looked at her mother for a long moment and said, "Are you sure?" And Claire had said for the first time in a long time. She was wearing the subpoena in the inside pocket of her blazer. That was not accurate. The subpoena was a legal document, not a physical sensation. But she was aware of it the way she was aware of the document in the fireproof box, the way certain things existed as weight rather than object. Joanna had delivered the recovered footage 2 days ago. Daniel's files had been transmitted, reviewed by Claire's attorney, and turned over to the relevant authorities. Along with the Foundation's financial records and a 12-page summary of the GAP, the Vance Future Leadership Fund, and its relationship to Arthur's board succession, and a series of tax filings that a federal examiner had now formally flagged for investigation. The subpoena had been delivered to the Foundation's counsel that morning. Arthur did not know that yet. Or perhaps he did, and had chosen to proceed anyway, a gamble. The play of a man who had spent 40 years believing that presentation could outlast documentation. That the right room, the right crowd, the right crest on the right napkin could stand between him and whatever came next. He was wrong, but he was on stage. She could see him from the entrance, silver-haired, patrician, in command at the podium. With the ease of a man delivering the address he had been preparing for years. The screens behind him had brightened to show a scrolling gallery, the Foundation's history. Photographs of grant recipients, images of the legacy the evening was celebrating. His voice carried over the murmur of the room with the particular authority of good acoustics and a lifetime's practice at being heard. The Vance name has always stood for something beyond mere financial achievement. It has stood for the stewardship of values. The investment in a future defined not by individual gain but by the continuity of excellence. Now, Claire said. She and Maya walked in. The room did not stop. Rooms like this one did not stop for entrances that was part of the architecture. The maintained social performance of people who had been trained since birth not to visibly react to disruption. But heads turned. She felt it, the ripple of attention, discreet but real, moving ahead of them as they crossed the floor toward the stage. Arthur saw her when she was 8 feet from the podium steps. She watched the moment of recognition arrive in his face, the slight recalibration, the reassertion of control. He kept speaking. His voice didn't waver. She reached the stage steps and looked at the room behind her. The Foundation's AV coordinator, a young man she had reached the previous afternoon through a contact at the hotel, a brief conversation. A clearly stated explanation of what she would need and why, was standing at the production console along the far wall. He met her eyes, nodded. She climbed the steps. Arthur stopped speaking. The room held its breath in the way of 200 people simultaneously deciding whether to look at the stage or at their neighbors. The event coordinator appeared from the wing, a woman in a headset, moving with the urgent control of someone whose evening had just exceeded its parameters. And Claire looked at her with a quality of calm that stopped her mid-step. Not aggression, not theatrics, just the particular steadiness of someone who has done the preparation and is now simply executing it. She took the microphone. "My name is Claire Miller," she said. Her voice was even, amplified, it carried to every corner of the room. "I'm Arthur Vance's daughter. Most of you don't know I exist. That's something he arranged in 2006, with the assistance of an attorney and a notary, when I was 17 years old." The room was absolutely still. Tonight the Vance Foundation was planning to introduce the next generation of its legacy. "I'd like to help with that." She nodded toward the production console. The screens changed. The footage was 21 years old and it showed, with the flat clarity of an exterior security camera on a wet November night, the porch of a house on Haverford Street in Atlanta. It showed a teenage girl with a single suitcase standing in the rain. It showed, through the lit window of the study behind her, a man at a desk, feeding documents into a shredder with methodical efficiency. It showed a woman closing heavy doors from the inside. It showed the deadbolt. It ran for 4 minutes and 37 seconds. No one in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Hotel spoke during those 4 minutes and 37 seconds. The only sounds were the ambient hiss of the AV system and, near the front of the room, the very quiet sound of someone beginning to cry. "Today," Claire said, when the footage ended and the screens returned to the Foundation's crest. A federal examiner confirmed the opening of a formal investigation into the Vance Foundation's financial filings, specifically relating to the management of the Future Leadership Restricted Endowment over the past 12 fiscal years. She reached into her blazer. "This is a subpoena. It was served to the Foundation's counsel this morning." She looked at Arthur. He had not moved from the podium. He was standing very still, in the posture of a man who has built his entire life on the management of appearances, and has just encountered the one appearance he cannot manage. His face had undergone the particular change of someone watching something he had arranged and sealed and locked away, arranged, he believed, permanently arrive, anyway. Illuminated on a 20-foot screen in the room he had most wanted to control. 2 men near the ballroom entrance were already moving quietly, efficiently, with the purposeful geometry of federal authorities, who had been waiting and had now received their signal. "I am not a ghost anymore," Claire said. She was looking at Arthur when she said it. He looked back at her, and for a moment, one moment, before the men reached him, and his attorney materialized at his elbow and the room dissolved into the organized chaos of something irreversible in motion. She saw something in his face she had never expected to see there. He saw her, not the problem, not the liability, not the line item, her. It lasted half a second. Then it was gone, replaced by the hard, managed expression of a man preparing to contest something. And she released it, let it go, let it be what it was, too small, too late, and enough, just barely enough to confirm that there had always been a her to see. Maya was at her side. She had crossed the floor while Claire spoke, had climbed the steps with the quiet confidence of someone who had been told the whole truth and had chosen to show up anyway. And now she stood beside her mother on the stage of the Whitmore Hotel ballroom and looked at the room with the clear, steady gaze of a 19-year-old. Who was going to be a cardiologist and who already understood that the heart, when it finally tells the truth, cannot be unheard. The handcuffs clicked. The audit is complete, Father, Claire said. Chicago came back to them slowly, the way home always does after you've been somewhere that required you to be someone you no longer are. The flight north had been quiet, Maya asleep against the window before they reached cruising altitude. The particular sleep of someone young enough to surrender to exhaustion without deliberating over it. Claire had sat beside her with a sparkling water she didn't drink and watched the clouds below the plane catch the last of the Georgia light. Going orange and then rose and then the deep, sourceless gray of altitude, and felt something she hadn't been able to name until they were on the ground again. And the familiar architecture of the city was reassembling itself around her through the taxi window. She felt like herself. Not the self she performed, not the self that wore the tailored blazer and kept the controlled expression and spoke in the careful, measured register of someone for whom every word was calculated before it was released. That self was necessary and she didn't disrespect it. It had kept her and Maya alive and solvent and protected for 15 years, and it would keep doing so. But it was not the whole of her. The self she felt like was older and quieter and less defended. The self that had been there before the calculating began. Before the leaving, before the building, before the long practice of converting grief into competence. Something underneath all of it. Something that had survived. She had not expected to find it at a gala in Buckhead. She was not sentimental about the venue. They were on the balcony by 9 in the morning, 2 days after Atlanta. The November cold had relented slightly, Chicago weather operating on its own inscrutable logic. Offering 48 degrees and actual sunlight as though in acknowledgement of something, and they had brought blankets and coffee and Maya's anatomy textbook, which was serving as a lap desk for her notebook, which she was filling with differential diagnosis notes for a cardiology seminar that started in a week. You haven't asked me anything, Claire said. Maya looked up. She had her mother's sharpness around the eyes, the quality of attention that was never entirely at rest, and something her own in the rest of it. A generosity of expression that Claire knew she hadn't taught and hadn't inherited and was grateful for. I was waiting for you to be ready, Maya said. That's very patient of you. I learned it somewhere. She smiled. How are you? The question arrived with the directness Maya brought to everything, not a social lubricant. Not a filler, an actual inquiry from a person who wanted an actual answer. Claire looked out at the city. 14 stories below, the street was doing its morning thing: foot traffic, coffee cups. The determined forward motion of people on their way to where they were going. Which was the way of cities, which was what she had loved about Chicago from the first week she'd arrived, with a single carry-on and a name she hadn't yet put on anything. Everyone going forward. No one required to be what they'd been somewhere else. At 38, she said, I finally learned that starting over isn't failure. She paused. It's freedom. She picked up her coffee and held it. The warmth of it was specific and good, the weight of the mug, the smell of it. The simple fact of sitting here in the morning light with the person she loved most in the world, on a balcony that was hers, in a city she had chosen, with a life she had built from nothing that anyone gave her. The news had run the story for 3 days. She had not watched it after the first coverage had muted the alerts on her phone, had asked her assistant to handle the press inquiries, had sat with the knowledge that the thing was in motion without needing to monitor its motion. Arthur's resignation from the foundation's board had been announced through counsel. The federal investigation was formal and ongoing. She'd been told to expect the process to take 12 to 18 months. Which was the nature of financial investigations, the slow machinery of institutional accountability. Eleanor had retained separate representation. Daniel had called twice. The first call had been after Atlanta, brief and exhausted in the way of someone who has just put down something they'd been carrying for years and hasn't yet decided how to feel about the absence of it. The second call had been yesterday. Longer. He'd talked about his daughter, whom Claire had never met, who was 8 years old and apparently remarkable. They had made plans, cautiously, to exist in each other's lives. She looked at the door of her firm, visible through the balcony window from this angle, her name on the glass in clean, dark letters. Miller Asset Management. She had chosen Miller deliberately at 20, not as erasure but as foundation, a name she picked up and built on, that she made mean something through the work she did under it, that belonged to her in the way that only things you build entirely yourself can belong to you. She had signed the new trust document for Maya yesterday morning. Her attorney had walked her through it, not that it required walking through. She had understood every clause as they went, but she'd wanted it witnessed and proper and slow, each signature deliberate. Maya's name on every page as beneficiary, as trustee of her own future, as the person Claire had organized her entire adult life around protecting. The document stated that the trust was to be distributed at Maya's discretion, in a manner consistent with her values and judgment. No conditions, no contingencies, no any dependence thereof, just Maya, and the resources to be whoever Maya was going to be, which, going by the evidence accumulated across 19 years, was someone significant. For the first time, Claire said, still looking at the city, when I signed my own name, she stopped. Found the right word for it, which was not a large word. It felt like mine. Maya set down her notebook. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand over her mother's warm, present, unhesitating, and left it there. They sat like that in the November light, with the coffee going pleasantly cool between them and the city carrying on below and the morning doing what mornings did. Which was to offer, without promise or guarantee, the uncomplicated fact of continuing. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Friends, how did you find today's story? Claire Miller was erased at 17. Not by accident, deliberately, methodically, with a notary and a shredder and a deadbolt, by the two people who were supposed to be the last ones standing between her and the world. She was made into a legal ghost before her daughter even took her first breath. And yet, she showed up at that gala not because she needed revenge. Not because she needed the Vances to finally see her, to finally say the thing they should have said 20 years ago. She showed up because she understood something most of us learn too late. The only signature that matters is the one you put on the life you build yourself. What Claire did with every year after that porch, every client protected, every dollar managed with care, every morning spent raising a daughter who could look Arthur Vance in the eye without flinching, that was not surviving. That was living, deliberately, fiercely, entirely on her own terms. And that's the lesson, isn't it? Not that justice always comes, though sometimes, thank goodness, it does. But that the most powerful thing any of us can do, after we've been told we don't count, after someone has tried to make us small or invisible or manageable, is to build something so real and so undeniably ours that the paperwork can't touch it. Claire built a firm. She built a daughter. She built a name that meant something, a life that was hers from the ground up. And when the past finally came looking for her, she didn't run from it. She audited it. I hope this story brought you something meaningful today. Maybe it's the reminder that what they said about you isn't the final word. Maybe it's the knowledge that the numbers always tell the truth, even when people don't. Or maybe it's just the image of a woman and her daughter, on a balcony in the November light, drinking coffee that's going cold and not caring at all. Whatever you're carrying, I hope it feels a little lighter after today. If this story moved you, please subscribe and hit that like button. It means more than you know. We'll see you next time.